April 1945, Northern Germany. The morning air hung thick with ash and dampness as Helga Schmidt stood in the courtyard of what had been a Wehrmacht administrative building 3 weeks earlier. Now British flags snapped against grey skies where swastikas once flew. The war was ending, everyone could feel it. But for Helga and the 200 women gathered in nervous clusters around her, the future remained a void more terrifying than the past. They had been soldiers, auxiliaries, radio operators, clerks, cogs in a machine now ground to dust. The concrete beneath their feet still bore scorch marks from hasty document burnings. Someone had tried to erase history, but history was not so easily destroyed. A British officer emerged from the building, young, perhaps 25, with a face that seemed too kind for a conqueror. He carried no weapon. Behind him came other soldiers, equally unburdened by rifles or menace. They simply stood there, these victors, watching the assembled German women with expressions Helga could not read. Not hatred, not triumph. Something else entirely. "They're going to shoot us," whispered Frida, standing beside her. Frida had been a typist in Kiel, had never fired a weapon, had never wanted this war. But guilt required no proof of personal sin in those days. The entire nation wore it like a second skin. The officer spoke in careful German, accented but clear. "You will form orderly lines. You will follow us. You will not be harmed." Those final 4 words hung in the air like a promise too fragile to believe. The women had heard promises before. They had made promises themselves, to a Reich that would last 1,000 years, to a Führer who could not lose, to a cause that now lay shattered across a continent of graves. What were British promises worth when measured against such wreckage? They formed lines because soldiers, even defeated ones, still understood orders. They walked because there was nowhere left to run. Through streets where German civilians watched from shattered windows with hollow eyes, through checkpoints manned by men who spoke languages Helga barely recognized. Polish, Czech, French, all the conquered now made conquerors. They marched towards some unknown destination, some unnamed fate. The war had been ending in stages. Each defeat another layer of skin stripped away until the raw truth lay exposed beneath. Helga had been in Bremen when the British crossed the Rhine. She had watched the Wehrmacht retreat. No longer an army, but a mob of exhausted ghosts. She had burned her uniform, buried her service documents in a garden that would never bloom again, and tried to become invisible. But invisibility was impossible when an entire nation had been made complicit. The Allies were uncovering everything now, the camps, the mass graves, the systematic machinery of death that had operated behind the lines while soldiers like Helga typed requisition forms and filed reports and told themselves they were just doing their jobs. The British were the gentlest of the conquerors, or so the rumours said. The Russians were a different matter entirely. In the east, women fled westward, with stories that turned blood cold. The Americans were pragmatic, efficient, distant. But the British seemed almost apologetic about their victory. As though winning had embarrassed them somehow. This made them more frightening in certain ways. Enemies you could understand. Mercy was more complicated. They walked for perhaps 40 minutes, through ruins that had been a city, past craters where homes once stood, past lampposts that bore no bodies now but still whispered of months when summary justice decorated every street corner. The Allied bombs had been democratic in their destruction, reducing rich and poor alike to equal rubble. Helga had thought in those final weeks that Germany was being erased from the earth, that perhaps this was justice, that perhaps they deserved to be unmade as thoroughly as they had unmade others. The building they finally reached stood mostly intact, a minor miracle in a landscape of obliteration. It had been a cinema once, judging by the faded posters still clinging to one wall. Now it was something else. The British soldiers held the doors open, gestured for the women to enter. No one moved. The threshold represented a boundary they could not uncross, a point of no return in a journey already defined by irreversible crossings. "Please," the young officer said, and there was something in his voice, not impatience, not cruelty, but a kind of urgent sadness that made Helga take the first step. The others followed because humans are herd animals, because momentum carries us when will fails, because sometimes obedience is the last refuge of the terrified. Inside, the darkness felt absolute after the grey daylight. Then the projector started. The screen blazed white, and for a moment, Helga thought perhaps this was it. This was the execution. They would be shot in the darkness while watching their own judgment displayed in silver light. But no bullets came. Instead, images appeared. A gate. The words Arbit macht frei in iron letters. Then the camera moved forward. What followed defied language. The human mind, confronted with the unprecedented, reaches for comparisons, for metaphors, for some framework to contain horror. But no framework existed for this. The bodies stacked like cordwood, the skeletal figures who could barely be called living, their eyes enormous in shrunken faces, their skin stretched over bones like parchment over sticks, the pits filled with corpses, thousands of them, tens of thousands, naked and tangled and reduced to mere matter, the gas chambers disguised as showers, the crematoriums working day and night. The belongings sorted into vast warehouses, children's shoes in mountains, eyeglasses in oceans, human hair baled like cotton. The film was British, shot by their army cameramen as they liberated Bergen-Belsen just days earlier. The narration spoke in English, which most of the women could not understand, but understanding was unnecessary. The images required no translation. They spoke a universal language of atrocity. Helga felt her stomach convulse. Around her, women were sobbing, vomiting, fainting. Someone was screaming in the darkness, a sound like an animal caught in a trap. But the film continued, relentless, methodical, documenting every detail with the precision of a coroner cataloguing wounds. Here were the guards, well-fed and indifferent, forced now to bury the dead they had created. Here were the survivors, if they could be called that, hovering between human and ghost. Here was the bureaucratic efficiency of mass murder, the schedules and quotas and systematic extermination of entire peoples. "We didn't know," Frida was whispering beside her, over and over like a prayer or a curse. "We didn't know." But they had known. Not the details, perhaps, not the full scope, but they had known something. Everyone had known something. The Jewish families that disappeared overnight, the trains that came back empty, the whispered rumours that were never quite investigated, never quite believed, because believing would have required action, and action would have required courage, and courage was in short supply when fear ruled every street. They had known enough to look away, and looking away was its own form of participation. The film showed British soldiers, grown men who had survived Normandy and the Ardennes, weeping openly as they tried to care for prisoners too far gone to save. It showed doctors overwhelmed by diseases they had only read about in medieval texts. Typhus, dysentery, starvation so profound the body began consuming itself. It showed German civilians from nearby towns, well-dressed and well-fed, forced to tour the camps they had lived beside, their faces registering shock that looked almost genuine, as though the smell of burning flesh had never reached their nostrils, as though they had never wondered where their neighbours went. When the lights finally came up, Helga could not see clearly. Her eyes were swollen from tears. She had not felt herself crying. Around her, women sat in stunned silence, or continued weeping, or stared at nothing with expressions of profound disconnection. Some had their hands over their mouths, as though trying to keep their souls from escaping. Some had torn at their own clothes, their own hair, as though punishing their bodies for the sins their minds had enabled. The young British officer stood before them, and now Helga understood his face, understood what she had seen in it earlier. It was the face of a man carrying knowledge he wished he could unlearn, forced to educate others in truths that destroyed innocence forever. He spoke softly, without anger, which somehow made it worse. "You have asked us what will happen to you. You have asked if you will be punished. but you see now that punishment is impossible. Nothing we could do to you approaches what has been done in your name. You were soldiers, auxiliaries, clerks. You typed the orders. You filed the reports. You kept the machines running. Perhaps you never pulled a trigger. Perhaps you never entered a camp. But you were part of this. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of worlds ending, of certainties collapsing, of every comfortable lie exposed to light. "You will be released," he continued, and a murmur went through the crowd. Relief, confusion, disbelief. "You will go home, or what remains of home. You will rebuild your lives in a Germany that must be rebuilt entirely. And you will carry this knowledge with you. You will tell your children. You will tell your grandchildren. You will ensure that no one can ever say they did not know, that no one can ever claim ignorance again." He paused, looked at each section of the room as though memorizing faces. "That is your punishment and your responsibility, to live with what you have learned here, to let it change everything." They were released that afternoon, given papers and directions, and sent back into a world that no longer made sense. Helga walked through the same ruined streets, but now they looked different. Every piece of rubble was a judgment, every hungry child a reminder, every closed door a question about who had lived behind it once and where they had gone and who had watched them go. The British had done something extraordinary, she realized later. They had not beaten them, they had not starved them, they had not raped them or enslaved them or executed them, though by any measure of justice they might have claimed such rights. Instead, they had shown them truth. They had weaponized knowledge, had made witnesses of accomplices, had transformed soldiers into mourners. In the months that followed, Germany would be divided, occupied, reconstructed. The Nuremberg trials would attempt to pass individual guilt from collective responsibility. Millions would claim they were only following orders, only doing their jobs, only trying to survive. And some of that would even be true, in the limited way that survival is always its own justification. But for Helga and the women who had stood in that darkened cinema, truth had become inescapable. She thought often of those British soldiers in the years after, the young men who had liberated camps and documented horrors and then, instead of taking revenge, had chosen education. It would have been easier to hate them if they had been cruel. It would have been simpler if they had been monsters. But they had been merely human, which meant that humans were capable of this, both the atrocity and the mercy, both the genocide and the liberation, both the lie and the insistence on truth. Helga never spoke of that day to her children, though she had promised herself she would. The words could never seem to capture it. How do you explain the moment your entire understanding of yourself and your nation and your world collapsed into ash? How do you confess complicity without making it sound like excuse? She kept the newspaper clippings instead, yellowed articles about the trials, about the camps, about the slow, painful process of national reckoning. She kept them hidden in a box she never opened but never threw away, a kind of secular reliquary holding the remains of dead illusions. Germany rebuilt. The rubble was cleared, the buildings restored, prosperity returned like grass growing over battlefields. People learned not to ask too many questions about what their neighbours had done during the war. Silence became a kind of national project, a collective agreement to look forward rather than back. But some silences are louder than screams. In 1960, Helga read about Adolf Eichmann's capture in Argentina. In 1961, she watched portions of his trial on television, saw the glass booth where the architect of genocide sat looking like an accountant, speaking of logistics and efficiency and orders. She recognized something in him, the way he passed responsibility into such fine pieces that no single piece seemed to weigh anything at all. She recognized it because she had felt it herself, the temptation to subdivide guilt until it disappeared into bureaucratic abstraction. By then, her own children were grown. They belonged to a new Germany, one that taught the history she had lived through, that made remembrance a national duty. They knew the facts, the numbers, the camps by name. But knowing facts is different from understanding truth. They had not stood in that darkened cinema. They had not felt the world shift beneath their feet. They had not experienced the specific horror of recognition, of seeing clearly for the first time what you have been part of. Helga died in 1987, 2 years before the Berlin Wall fell, before Germany reunited, before history began its next chapter. She died carrying that day in April 1945 like a stone she had swallowed, solid and heavy and indigestible, a truth that had sustained and poisoned her in equal measure. The British soldiers who showed that film, those young men who had wept alongside their former enemies, who had chosen documentation over retribution, they understood something profound about justice. They understood that the deepest punishment is knowledge, that the most permanent prison is conscience, that the most lasting victory is the one that changes minds rather than breaking bodies. In the end, the line they made those German women form was not a line toward execution, but toward testimony. They became witnesses to their own complicity, custodians of an unbearable truth. They learned that ignorance, once shattered, cannot be reassembled. They discovered that there are some things that, once seen, remake you entirely, that transform you into someone who can never again claim the comfort of not knowing. This is the terrible grace of truth. It liberates and condemns simultaneously. It shows you who you were, so you might choose who to become. Those women walked out of that cinema into a world that would never again be simple, where every choice would be haunted by the knowledge of what choices can lead to, where the comfortable lies of nationalism and obedience and just following orders had been burned away like fog before a relentless sun. They were soldiers once, clerks and typists and auxiliaries, small parts in a vast machine. They became something else that day. Witnesses, mourners, unwilling prophets of a history that must never be forgotten. Carrying a burden the British understood was both punishment and redemption, to know what was done, to live with that knowing, to ensure the next generation never forgets. This was the line they formed, stretching from that day into all the days that followed, a human chain of memory binding past to future, atrocity to accountability, ignorance to the unbearable necessary light of truth.